The distant echo of a gunshot shattered the tranquil dawn over Red Bluff, Colorado. As Clara Galloway clutched her father's pocket watch with trembling fingers, watching the hands tick onward with cruel indifference while her world crumbled around her. The morning's golden light seemed to mock her grief as she knelt in the dust of the main street. Her cream-colored dress, already stained with the blood of the only family she had left in this harsh frontier world. Red Bluff had never been kind to the Galloways. Clara's father, Josiah Galloway, had moved them west after her mother's death from consumption 3 years prior, chasing rumors of gold and opportunity in the Colorado Territory. Their dreams of prosperity had died slowly. Then suddenly, with the sharp crack of a bullet fired from the gun of Elias Walton, the ruthless cattle baron who now controlled most of the county. "Miss," a deep voice called from somewhere above her, but Clara couldn't lift her gaze from her father's still face. "Miss, you can't stay here in the street." Clara remained frozen, her voice locked behind the wall of grief that had consumed her. The tears wouldn't come, nothing would come. She simply existed in a void where time had no meaning and sound was distant, as though she were underwater. A shadow fell across her, and Clara felt the presence of someone kneeling beside her. She didn't look up, couldn't look up. Rough, calloused hands gently reached for her father's body, and instinctively she tightened her grip. "I'm not taking him from you," the man said softly, "but we need to move him from the street. Let me help you." For the first time, Clara raised her eyes to meet those of a stranger. He wore the dust of the trail on his clothes, a weathered Stetson pushed back on his head revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the edges. His face was tanned from the sun, and a short beard framed a strong jaw. But it was his eyes, deep blue and filled with a compassion that seemed out of place in this merciless town, that made Clara release her grip on her father's jacket. "My name is Lucas Nash," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm going to help you take care of him properly." Lucas motioned to another man standing nearby, and together they carefully lifted Josiah Galloway's body. Clara tried to stand, but found her legs wouldn't support her. Without a word, Lucas gestured to his companion to continue toward the undertakers, then turned back and simply sat down in the dust beside Clara. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer empty platitudes or ask questions she couldn't answer. He simply sat in silence, a steadfast presence while Clara's world spun wildly around her. They remained that way for what might have been minutes or hours, Clara lost in the abyss of her grief, the stranger keeping quiet vigil beside her. The town continued to move around them. People passed by, some staring, others averting their eyes from the raw display of sorrow in their midst. Lucas occasionally nodded at passers-by but made no move to leave. When the sun had shifted position in the sky, casting longer shadows across the dusty main street, Lucas finally spoke again. "Is there someone I can take you to? Family or friends?" Clara shook her head almost imperceptibly. "A place where you're staying, then?" Another slight movement, barely a nod. Clara's throat felt sealed shut, her words buried under the weight of what she'd witnessed. Lucas stood slowly, brushing the dust from his denim pants. "I'm going to help you up now, if that's all right." He didn't wait for a response she couldn't give, but gently placed his hands under her elbows and lifted her to her feet. Clara swayed slightly, and his steady hands remained, providing support without demanding anything in return. "Point the way," he said softly. Clara managed to gesture vaguely down the street toward a small boarding house at the edge of town. Lucas kept one hand lightly at her elbow as they walked, slowing his natural stride to match her sluggish movements. The few people they passed on the wooden sidewalks gave them a wide berth, whispers following in their wake. The boarding house was a simple two-story structure painted a faded blue that had seen better days. Mrs. Abernathy, the stern but fair widow who ran the establishment, opened the door before they reached it. Her usual stoic expression softened with concern. "I heard what happened," she said, ushering them inside. "Terrible business. Simply terrible." Clara still couldn't speak, her eyes fixed on some middle distance only she could see. "She needs rest," Lucas said, his voice firm but respectful, "and privacy." Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "Second floor, third door on the right. I'll bring up some tea shortly." Lucas guided Clara up the narrow staircase and to her room. It was a small space, sparsely furnished with a single bed, a washstand, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. A worn quilt in faded blues and yellows covered the mattress, and a single window looked out over the dusty street below. "I'll wait outside while you get settled," Lucas said, moving toward the door. Clara's hand shot out suddenly, grasping his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes, though red-rimmed and haunted, conveyed what her voice could not, a desperate plea not to be left alone. Lucas nodded in understanding. "I'll stay then," he said softly. He gestured to a small wooden chair in the corner. "I'll just sit over there if that's all right." Clara released his wrist and sank onto the edge of the bed, her movements mechanical. Lucas settled into the chair, removed his hat, and simply waited. The silence between them was heavy but somehow comforting, an acknowledgment of grief too profound for words. Mrs. Abernathy arrived with tea as promised, casting a suspicious glance at Lucas that softened when she saw the respectful distance he maintained. She placed the tray on the small table by the window and departed with a whispered, "Let me know if you need anything else, dear." The tea grew cold, untouched. Outside the window, the day progressed toward evening, shadows lengthening across the walls of the small room. Clara remained seated on the edge of the bed, occasionally twisting her father's pocket watch in her hands, the quiet tick-tick-tick the only sound besides their breathing. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the room, Lucas finally spoke again. "You should try to rest," he said gently. "I can come back tomorrow if you'd like." Clara's eyes snapped to his face, the first real awareness she'd shown in hours. She shook her head firmly. "You want me to stay," Lucas said, not a question but a statement of understanding. Clara nodded, a single tear finally breaking free to trail down her cheek. "Then I'll stay," he promised, settling back in the uncomfortable chair. The night passed slowly. Clara eventually lay down atop the quilt, still fully dressed, her eyes open and staring at the ceiling. Lucas remained in his chair, occasionally shifting his position but never complaining. A few times he thought she might have drifted to sleep, only to see her fingers resume their restless movement on the pocket watch chain. Dawn brought a soft pink glow through the thin curtains. Lucas had dozed intermittently, his head drooping toward his chest before jerking upright again. Clara hadn't moved, but her eyes tracked the changing light across the ceiling. A gentle knock at the door announced Mrs. Abernathy with a tray of breakfast simple fare of biscuits, jam, and coffee. She raised an eyebrow at finding Lucas still there, but again said nothing, merely placing the tray on the table and departing. "You should eat something," Lucas suggested, pouring a cup of coffee and bringing it to Clara. She sat up slowly, her movements stiff from hours of immobility. When she reached for the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and Lucas noted how cold her hands were despite the warm morning. Clara took a small sip of the coffee, then another. It seemed to revive her slightly, bringing a hint of color back to her pale cheeks. She looked at Lucas properly for the first time, taking in his rumpled appearance from spending the night in a chair. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible after the long silence. Lucas didn't make a big show of her finally speaking. He simply nodded and said, "You're welcome." "Why?" Clara asked, the single word encompassing so many questions. Lucas considered this as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "I know what it's like to lose someone suddenly," he finally said. "And to have no one there who understands that sometimes words just won't come." Clara looked down at the cup in her hands. "My father," she said, each word requiring visible effort. "They shot him, in the street, like he was nothing." "Walton's men?" Lucas asked quietly. Clara nodded, her knuckles whitening around the coffee cup. "He wouldn't sell our claim. It's all we had left." Lucas's expression darkened. "Elias Walton has been buying up every piece of land from here to the mountain pass. Those who won't sell tend to meet with accidents." "It wasn't an accident," Clara said, her voice suddenly stronger with anger. "It was murder, plain and simple, in front of half the town, and no one did a thing to stop it." "Walton owns the sheriff," Lucas explained grimly. "And most of the town council. People are afraid to stand against him." "And you?" Clara asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Are you afraid of him too?" Lucas held her gaze steadily. "I've learned to pick my battles carefully, but no, I don't fear Elias Walton the way others do." "Why not?" "Because I've seen men like him before," Lucas replied. "They seem invincible until they're not. Every man has a weakness." Clara set her coffee cup down with a decisive click. "I need to arrange my father's burial." "I'll help you," Lucas offered. "The undertaker, Mr. Gillespie, is one of the few honest men left in Red Bluff." Clara stood, smoothing her wrinkled dress with trembling hands. The bloodstains had dried to a rusty brown, a stark reminder of the previous day's horror. "I should change first," she said, glancing down at herself. Lucas nodded and rose from his chair. "I'll wait in the hallway." "Mr. Nash," Clara called as he reached for the door handle. When he turned back, she continued, "I don't understand why you're helping me, but I'm grateful. I don't think I could face this alone." "No one should have to," he answered simply, then stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him. Clara changed quickly into a simple dark blue dress, her only other garment besides her nightgown. She splashed water from the pitcher onto her face and attempted to bring order to her tangled auburn hair. Looking in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back at her. When she opened the door, she found Lucas leaning against the wall, hat in hand, waiting patiently as promised. He straightened when she appeared. "Ready?" he asked. Clara nodded, though in truth she would never be ready to bury her father. They descended the stairs in silence, nodding to Mrs. Abernathy as they passed through the small front parlor. The morning sun was bright and merciless as they stepped onto the street. Clara squinted against the light, pausing on the boarding house steps. Lucas seemed to sense her hesitation and offered his arm for support. After a moment's pause, she placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, drawing strength from the solid presence beside her. The undertaker's establishment was located at the far end of the main street. A somber building painted a dark green that had faded to the color of pine needles in winter. A simple sign reading "Gillespie Funeral Services" hung above the door. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of cedar and chemical preservatives. Mr. Gillespie, a thin man with a shock of white hair despite his relatively youthful face, greeted them solemnly. "Miss Galloway," he said, bowing slightly, "your father has been prepared. I took the liberty of obtaining his best suit from your quarters at the boarding house." He glanced at Lucas with mild surprise. "Mr. Nash, I didn't realize you were acquainted with the Galloways." "A recent introduction," Lucas replied, his hand moving subtly to the small of Clara's back in a gesture of support. "I'd like to see him," Clara said, her voice stronger than it had been, though still fragile. Mr. Gillespie nodded and led them to a small viewing room at the rear of the building. Josiah Galloway lay in a simple pine coffin, his hands crossed over his chest. Someone had cleaned and combed his silver-streaked hair, and in the dark suit, he looked almost peaceful if not for the unnatural stillness that only death can bring. Clara approached slowly, Lucas remaining a respectful step behind. She reached out to touch her father's hand, then drew back at the cold, waxy feel of his skin. "When can we bury him?" she asked, not turning around. "Tomorrow morning would be appropriate," Mr. Gillespie answered. "I've spoken with Pastor Williams. He's available at 10 o'clock. Clara nodded. "And the cost?" she asked, her voice catching. "Your father's affairs are in order, Miss Galloway," Mr. Gillespie assured her. "He made arrangements some time ago after your arrival in town. Everything has been paid for." Clara's shoulders sagged with relief. She hadn't known how she would manage the expense, with only a few dollars to her name. "There's the matter of the plot," Mr. Gillespie continued. "Your father purchased one next to where your mother's memorial stone was placed. I understand she's buried back east, but he wanted a marker for her here." "Yes," Clara confirmed, memories flooding back of the small ceremony they'd held upon arriving in Red Bluff, placing a simple stone in memory of Elizabeth Galloway, who had never lived to see the western frontier her husband had dreamed of. "Then it's settled," Mr. Gillespie said, making a note in a leather-bound ledger on a small desk in the corner. 10 o'clock tomorrow. Will there be anyone else attending?" Clara opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She realized with a pang that she didn't know if her father had made any friends in town. They had kept mostly to themselves, working their small claim and trying to build a new life. "I'll be there," Lucas said quietly from behind her. Clara turned to him, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. They left the undertaker's and walked slowly back toward the boarding house. The town was now fully awake, with people going about their business along the main street. Several cast curious or sympathetic glances toward Clara, but no one approached. "You should eat something more substantial than those biscuits from this morning," Lucas suggested as they passed the town's only restaurant, a modest establishment called the Silver Spoon. Clara shook her head. "I couldn't." "You need to keep up your strength," Lucas persisted gently. "Just some soup, perhaps." Before Clara could protest further, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A group of men on horseback had arrived in town, dust rising from beneath their horses' hooves as they came to a stop in front of the saloon. At their center, mounted on a magnificent black stallion, sat Elias Walton himself. Clara froze, her hand unconsciously tightening on Lucas's arm. Walton was a large man, broad-shouldered and imposing even from a distance. His thick mustache and expensive clothes marked him as a man of means, and the casual way he surveyed the town spoke of his confidence in his own power. "We should go," Lucas murmured, attempting to steer Clara toward a side street, but it was too late. Walton had noticed them, his gaze fixing on Clara with recognition. He said something to one of his men, then dismounted and began walking in their direction. "Miss Galloway," he called, his voice carrying down the street. "A moment of your time, if you please." Clara stood rooted to the spot, her face draining of color. Lucas moved slightly in front of her, a subtle but clear protective gesture. Walton approached, flanked by two of his men. He stopped a few paces away, removing his hat in a mockery of respect. "Miss Galloway, I wanted to express my condolences for your recent loss," he said, his tone falsely sympathetic. "Your father was a stubborn man, but I respected his conviction." "You murdered him," Clara said, the words torn from her throat before she could stop them. Walton's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into a practiced look of regret. A tragic misunderstanding, I assure you. My associate acted without authorization when your father drew his weapon. That's a lie, Clara replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. My father never carried a gun. Everyone knows that. Walton shrugged, replacing his hat. Nevertheless, what's done is done. I've come to make you a generous offer for your father's claim. More than it's worth, to be frank, but I consider it a gesture of goodwill in light of your circumstances. Lucas stepped forward. Miss Galloway is in mourning, Walton. This isn't the time or place for business discussions. Walton's eyes narrowed as he took in Lucas fully for the first time. Nash, he said, recognition and dislike evident in his tone. I wasn't aware you were acquainted with the Galloways. Recent introduction, Lucas repeated his earlier explanation, his voice cool. I see. Walton turned his attention back to Clara. My offer stands until sunset tomorrow, Miss Galloway. After that, the price drops considerably. I suggest you consider it carefully. A young woman alone in these parts has few prospects. The threat behind his words was thinly veiled. Get out of our way, Lucas said quietly, his hand moving casually to rest near the pistol at his hip. Walton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. I wouldn't dream of further distressing the lady. He tipped his hat again. Until tomorrow, Miss Galloway. He and his men returned to their horses, mounting up and continuing toward the saloon. Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Come on, Lucas said gently, guiding her toward the boarding house. Let's get you inside. Once they were safely back in her room, Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, her brief surge of anger giving way to exhaustion. He'll never stop, she said dully. He'll take everything. Lucas leaned against the wall, his expression thoughtful. Why is your claim so important to him? There must be dozens of small holdings he could acquire more easily. Clara looked up in surprise. You don't know, Lucas shook his head. I've only been in Red Bluff for a few weeks. I know Walton's reputation, but not the specifics of his dealings with your father. Water, Clara said simply. Our claim has the only reliable spring-fed stream that doesn't dry up in summer for miles around. The water rights alone are worth more than the land. Lucas nodded slowly in understanding. And with those rights, Walton could control access for all the surrounding ranches and farms. Exactly. Clara twisted her father's watch chain between her fingers. My father refused to sell because he knew what Walton would do: charge exorbitant prices for water access and drive smaller operations out of business. Your father sounds like a principled man. He was, Clara agreed, her voice catching. He believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. She looked up at Lucas. What am I going to do? I can't fight Walton alone, but I can't just give him what he wants, not after what he did to my father. Lucas crossed to the window, looking out at the town below. You don't have to decide anything today, he said. Get through the burial tomorrow and then we'll consider your options. Clara questioned softly. Lucas turned back to her. If you'll allow it, I'd like to help you figure this out. Why? Clara asked, the same question she'd posed earlier. You don't know me. This isn't your fight. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, seeming to debate how much to reveal. 2 years ago, I owned a small ranch in Wyoming territory, he finally said. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. A man like Walton decided he wanted my water rights too. His jaw tightened at the memory. I refused to sell. One night my cabin burned down with my wife inside. Clara gasped softly. I'm so sorry. Lucas nodded, accepting her sympathy without comment. It was ruled an accident. No proof of foul play, but I knew. His eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a combination of old pain and resolve. I've been drifting since then, taking odd jobs, keeping to myself, but maybe I've been drifting long enough. Clara absorbed this information, seeing Lucas in a new light. Not just a kind stranger, but someone who truly understood her loss and her situation. "What happened to the man who took your land?" she asked. A grim smile touched Lucas's lips. "Nothing yet, but someday, when he least expects it, justice will find him." He straightened, visibly setting aside the dark memories. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be difficult." Clara wanted to protest that she wasn't tired, but the truth was that grief and emotional exhaustion were taking their toll. "Will you?" she began, then hesitated. "I'll stay nearby," Lucas assured her. "Mrs. Abernathy has a spare room she's allowing me to use. I'll be just down the hall if you need anything." Clara nodded, relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Nash." "Lucas," he corrected gently. "I think we're beyond formalities at this point." "Lucas," Clara repeated, "and I'm Clara." He nodded and moved toward the door. "Try to get some sleep, Clara. I'll check on you later." After he left, Clara did try to rest, but sleep remained elusive. Her mind was too full of grief, fear, and now the new complications Lucas Nash had introduced. He was right that she didn't need to make any decisions immediately, but Walton's deadline loomed large. As the afternoon wore on, Clara forced herself to eat some of the food Mrs. Abernathy brought up a simple stew with bread that tasted like ashes in her mouth, but which she knew she needed for strength. Then she set about the grim task of preparing for her father's funeral. From her trunk, she removed the black armband she had worn after her mother's death. The sight of it brought fresh pain. It seemed cruelly unfair to be orphaned twice before the age of 25. She had a black shawl as well, which would have to serve in place of proper mourning attire. A soft knock at the door interrupted her preparations. When she opened it, she found Lucas standing there with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you might not have appropriate." He gestured vaguely, clearly uncomfortable. Clara accepted the package and unwrapped it to find a simple but elegant black bonnet with a short veil. "I asked at the general store what might be suitable," Lucas explained, looking somewhat embarrassed. "The owner's wife helped select it. I hope it's appropriate." Clara was touched by the thoughtful gesture. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Lucas nodded, clearly relieved. "I'll leave you to your preparations then." "Would you like me to escort you to dinner downstairs later?" Clara shook her head. "I don't think I can face everyone yet." "I understand. I'll arrange for a tray to be sent up." After Lucas left, Clara tried on the bonnet. The veil was just long enough to partially obscure her face, which would be a comfort during the funeral when facing the curious stares of the townspeople. The simple kindness of the gift brought tears to her eyes, the first she had been able to shed since her father's death. Once they started, she found she couldn't stop, and she sank to her knees beside the bed, finally releasing the tidal wave of grief she had been holding back. By the time Lucas returned with her dinner tray, Clara had cried herself into exhaustion. Her eyes were red and swollen, but there was a certain relief in having finally broken through the numbness. "You've been crying," Lucas observed, setting the tray down on the small table. "Yes," Clara admitted. "I needed to." Lucas nodded in understanding. "It helps sometimes, though it never feels like it at the time." They shared a quiet dinner, Clara eating little but making an effort for Lucas's sake. As darkness fell outside, Lucas lit the oil lamp on the bedside table. "Will you be all right alone tonight?" he asked. "I can sit in the chair again if you prefer." Clara considered this. His presence had been a comfort the night before, but she was also aware that he must be exhausted from his uncomfortable vigil. "I think I'll manage," she said. "But thank you for offering." "I'm just down the hall if you change your mind," Lucas reminded her. "Don't hesitate to knock, no matter the hour." After he left, Clara prepared for bed, changing into her nightgown and brushing out her hair. She lay down, expecting another sleepless night, but to her surprise, the emotional release of her tears had left her drained enough that sleep claimed her almost immediately. She dreamed of her father not as he had been in death, but as he had been in life, laughing, strong, full of plans for their future. In the dream, he cupped her face in his weathered hands and told her to be brave, that she wasn't alone. When she woke just before dawn, tears stained her pillow, but there was a new resolve in her heart. The morning of the funeral brought clear skies, and a gentle breeze, a beautiful day that seemed at odds with the solemn occasion. Clara dressed carefully in her blue dress with the black shawl and new bonnet, her father's pocket watch chain looped around her wrist like a bracelet, the watch itself tucked safely in her pocket. Lucas arrived to escort her, dressed in clean clothes with his hair neatly combed. He had trimmed his beard as well, Clara noticed, and wore a solemn black necktie with his usual work clothes. "You look nice," she said softly. "As do you," he replied with equal gentleness. "Are you ready?" Clara nodded, though the truth was more complicated. How could anyone ever be ready to bury their last remaining family? They walked together to the small church at the edge of town. It was a simple wooden structure with a modest steeple, surrounded by the town cemetery where weathered headstones marked the final resting places of Red Bluff's earlier residents. To Clara's surprise, a small crowd had gathered. Mr. Gillespie was there with the pine coffin, and Pastor William stood ready at the prepared graveside. But there were others as well, Mrs. Abernathy from the boarding house, the shopkeeper and his wife who had helped Lucas select the bonnet, several miners Clara recognized as having claims near her father's, and even Dr. Simmons, who had treated her father's rheumatism during the winter months. "I didn't think anyone would come," Clara whispered to Lucas as they approached. "Your father was respected," Lucas replied quietly. "And there are still good people in this town, despite Walton's influence." The service was brief but heartfelt. Pastor William spoke of Josiah Galloway's integrity and work ethic, of his devotion to his daughter, and of his belief in building a better future in the Western Territories. When he invited others to speak, several of the miners stepped forward to share anecdotes about Josiah's generosity or his knack for finding the humor in difficult situations. Clara stood silent throughout, Lucas a steady presence at her side. When it came time to lower the coffin into the ground, he gently took her hand, providing an anchor as she watched her father's mortal remains disappear into the earth. The first shovelful of dirt made a hollow thud against the coffin lid, and Clara flinched. Lucas's hand tightened around hers. "You can look away," he murmured. "You don't have to watch this part." Clara shook her head. "I need to see it through," she whispered back. "For him." So they stood together as the grave was filled, and afterward as the mourners came to offer their condolences. Several expressed outrage at the circumstances of Josiah's death, though in hushed tones with nervous glances toward town. "Your father was one of the few who stood up to Walton," an older miner named Davies told Clara. "We should have stood with him more openly." "It's not too late to stand together now," Lucas suggested quietly. Davies looked at him skeptically. "Easy for a drifter to say. Some of us have families to think about." As the crowd dispersed, Clara remained by the fresh grave. Lucas stayed with her, silent but supportive. She knelt to place a small bunch of wildflowers she had gathered that morning on the turned earth. "I don't know what to do, Father," she whispered. "I don't know how to honor what you stood for." Lucas gave her the privacy of this moment, stepping back a few paces and turning his attention to the surrounding gravestones. When Clara finally rose and rejoined him, her veil was damp with tears, but her composure had returned. "I've made my decision," she said as they walked back toward town. "I won't sell to Walton, not now, not ever." Lucas didn't look surprised. I thought you might say that, but you should know what you're up against. Walton doesn't take rejection well. I know the risks, Clara replied, but I can't let him win, not after what he did. My father died protecting that land and those water rights. I won't dishonor his memory by giving them up. Then we need a plan, Lucas said, his use of we confirming his commitment to helping her. Walton will be expecting your answer by sunset. I'll tell him to his face, Clara declared, a new fire in her eyes. Let him look me in the eye when I refuse him. Lucas frowned. That might not be the safest approach. I'm not concerned with safety, Clara retorted. I'm concerned with justice. They had reached the boarding house, and Lucas guided her to a small bench in the side garden where they could speak privately. Justice is worth pursuing, he agreed. But getting yourself killed won't serve any purpose. We need to be smart about this. Clara sighed, some of her bravado fading. What do you suggest? First, we secure your legal position. Do you have the deed to your father's claim? Clara nodded. In my trunk. Father always kept our important papers well organized. Good. Next, we need allies. Davies and some of the other independent miners might be willing to support you if they don't feel they're standing alone. And then, Clara asked. Lucas's expression grew more serious. Then we prepare for Walton's response. He won't take your refusal lightly. There might be threats, perhaps attempts to drive you off the land by force. I won't be intimidated, Clara said firmly. No, Lucas agreed with the ghost of a smile. I don't believe you will. But you'll need to be cautious, at least until we can build enough support to challenge Walton's control of the town. They spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing. Clara retrieved the deed and other legal documents from her trunk, and Lucas examined them carefully, confirming that her father had indeed left everything properly in her name. They then visited several of the miners who had attended the funeral, discreetly gauging their willingness to stand against Walton. The responses were mixed. Some, like Davies, expressed cautious support. Others were sympathetic, but unwilling to risk Walton's wrath. A few, however, seemed emboldened by Clara's determination, offering to help protect her claim if needed. As sunset approached, Clara and Lucas made their way to the saloon where Walton was known to conduct his business. The establishment, grandly named the Golden Palace, despite its modest appearance, was the largest building on the main street besides the hotel. Its swinging doors were flanked by two of Walton's men, who eyed Lucas and Clara with suspicious interest as they approached. Miss Galloway, one of them said with mock courtesy, Mr. Walton's been expecting you. Clara straightened her shoulders and stepped forward. I'm here to speak with him. The man nodded, glancing at Lucas. Alone. Mr. Nash accompanies me, Clara said firmly. Or I leave now with my answer undelivered. The guard hesitated, then shrugged. Your funeral, he muttered, then immediately looked abashed at his poor choice of words. Inside, the saloon was busy with the early evening crowd. A haze of smoke hung in the air, and the piano in the corner played a jaunty tune at odds with Clara's somber mood. Heads turned as she entered, conversations pausing momentarily at the unusual sight of a respectable woman in the establishment, especially one dressed in mourning attire. Elias Walton sat at a corner table, playing cards with several of his associates. He looked up as Clara and Lucas approached, a smile spreading beneath his thick mustache. Miss Galloway, he greeted her, setting down his cards and rising to his feet. I'm pleased you've decided to be reasonable. Please join me. He gestured to an empty chair at the table. I prefer to stand, Clara replied coldly. This won't take long. Walton's smile faltered slightly. As you wish. I assume you're here to accept my generous offer for your father's claim. No, Mr. Walton, Clara said clearly, her voice carrying in the suddenly quiet saloon. I'm here to inform you that the Galloway claim is not for sale, not to you, not to anyone." Walton's expression darkened. "I strongly advise you to reconsider, Miss Galloway. A young woman alone has no business trying to work a mining claim." "I won't be alone," Clara responded. "Several of the neighboring claim holders have offered their assistance, and Mr. Nash has agreed to partner with me in the venture." This was a slight embellishment of their earlier discussions, but Lucas didn't contradict her, merely shifting his stance slightly to indicate his support. Walton's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. "I see. Nash, you're making a serious error in judgment here. This doesn't concern you." "I've made it my concern," Lucas replied evenly. "My final answer is no," Clara reiterated. "The water rights remain with the Galloway claim, and access will continue to be granted to the smaller operations in the area at fair rates, as my father always intended." Walton's face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this decision, Miss Galloway. There are many ways to make life difficult for stubborn people in these parts." "Is that a threat, Walton?" Lucas asked, his hand moving casually toward his gun. Several of Walton's men tensed, hands similarly drifting toward their weapons. The other patrons of the saloon began edging toward the doors, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "Not at all," Walton replied smoothly, though his eyes remained hard. "Merely an observation about the realities of frontier life. Accidents happen, equipment breaks, supplies become scarce. And sometimes," Lucas said quietly, "powerful men discover they're not as untouchable as they believed." The tension in the room was palpable. For a long moment no one spoke or moved. Then Walton deliberately sat back down, picking up his cards. "We'll see," he said dismissively. "Good evening, Miss Galloway. I trust you can find your own way out." Clara held her ground a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the door, her head held high. Lucas followed, careful to keep himself between her and Walton's men until they were safely outside. Once they were a block away from the saloon, Clara's composed facade cracked slightly, and she trembled with the aftermath of the confrontation. "You did well in there," Lucas told her, guiding her toward a bench in front of the general store. "He'll come after us, won't he?" Clara asked, sinking onto the bench. Lucas nodded grimly. "Yes, but not immediately. He'll want to make it look legitimate, or at least not directly traceable to him. What do we do now? First, we get you settled at your claim. The boarding house is too exposed." Lucas glanced around the darkening street. "Then we prepare. And we watch." The next morning, they made preparations to move Clara to her father's claim outside of town. Mrs. Abernathy helped pack Clara's few belongings, while Lucas arranged for supplies and a wagon. By mid-afternoon, they were ready to depart. The Galloway claim was located about 3 miles from Red Bluff, nestled in a small valley where the precious spring-fed stream emerged from the hillside. The cabin Josiah had built was modest but solid, with 2 small rooms and a covered porch facing the stream. A tool shed stood nearby, along with a simple sluice box for panning gold from the stream. Clara hadn't been to the claim since her father's death, and returning without him brought a fresh wave of grief. She paused at the threshold of the cabin, momentarily overwhelmed. Lucas, sensing her distress, busied himself with unloading their supplies, giving her space to compose herself. When she finally entered the cabin, he followed with her trunk, setting it down in the corner of the main room. "It's a good location," he observed, looking out the window at the stream. "Defensible with clear sightlines to the approach road." Clara nodded, running her hand along the rough-hewn table her father had built. He loved it here, said it reminded him of the Virginia countryside where he grew up. They spent the remainder of the day settling in. Lucas checked the perimeter of the property, noting potential weaknesses in their security. Clara cleaned the cabin and organized their supplies. By evening, they had established a temporary routine, with Lucas insisting on sleeping in the tool shed to maintain propriety. As they sat on the porch after a simple dinner, watching the sunset paint the hills with golden light, Clara found herself studying her unlikely protector. In just a few days, Lucas Nash had become central to her world, a steady presence amid the chaos of grief and uncertainty. "Tell me about your wife," she said softly, "if it's not too painful to speak of her." Lucas was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "Her name was Sarah. We met in Denver, where she was teaching at a small school. She loved books, carried them everywhere, even when we moved to the ranch." A slight smile touched his lips at the memory. "She wasn't raised for frontier life, but she adapted, learned to shoot, to garden in difficult conditions, to make do with what we had." "She sounds remarkable," Clara said. "She was." Lucas looked out toward the darkening hills. "After she died, I couldn't stay at the ranch. Too many memories. So I sold what little was left after the fire and started moving from town to town, taking whatever work I could find, mostly as a ranch hand or doing odd jobs." "What brought you to Red Bluff?" Lucas shrugged. "Nothing in particular. It was just the next town on the road." He glanced at her. "Until I saw you in the street that day." Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest at his words. "I'm glad you were there," she said simply. "I don't know what I would have done otherwise." The days that followed established a new pattern for them. Clara took over the management of the claim, reviewing her father's records and learning the business aspects he had handled. Lucas helped with the physical labor, repairing equipment and reinforcing the cabin's defenses, while teaching Clara how to use the revolver he insisted she carry. They were cautious when venturing into town for supplies, always traveling together and maintaining a watchful awareness of their surroundings. Walton's men were often visible on the streets of Red Bluff, but made no overt moves against them. "He's biding his time," Lucas observed as they loaded supplies into their wagon one afternoon, "waiting for us to let our guard down. Or for public memory of my father's murder to fade," Clara added bitterly. "So whatever happens to us won't be so obviously connected." Despite the constant tension, Clara found herself adapting to her new life. The grief remained, a constant ache beneath her daily activities, but it was no longer the paralyzing force it had been in those first terrible hours. Having a purpose honoring her father's wishes for the claim and standing against Walton gave her strength. And having Lucas beside her gave her something else, something she wasn't quite ready to name, but which warmed her heart whenever their eyes met or their hands brushed accidentally during their shared tasks. A week after they had moved to the claim, the first test of their vigilance came. Clara woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the sound of Lucas's urgent voice at her door. "Clara, wake up. We have visitors." She was instantly alert, reaching for the revolver he'd insisted she keep by her bed. "Walton's men, 3 riders approaching from the north," Lucas confirmed. "Could be innocent travelers, but at this hour I doubt it." Clara dressed quickly in the darkness and joined Lucas on the porch, where he had positioned himself with a clear view of the approach road. "What's the plan?" she whispered, crouching beside him. "We wait and see what they want," Lucas replied. "But be ready to get inside if shooting starts." They watched as the 3 horsemen approached at a walk, their silhouettes gradually becoming clearer in the pale light of approaching dawn. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, conferring briefly before one rider continued forward alone. "Hello, the cabin," the man called when he was within speaking distance. "Don't shoot. I'm looking for Lucas Nash." Lucas tensed beside Clara. "I know that voice," he murmured, then stood cautiously. "Identify yourself," he called back. It's James Cooper, Lucas, from the Double C. Lucas relaxed slightly but kept his hand near his gun. Come ahead, James, slowly. The rider approached until his features were visible in the growing light, a young man perhaps a few years older than Clara, with a friendly face and an easy manner despite the tense circumstances. Lucas, he greeted with a nod. Been a while. Almost 2 years, Lucas agreed. What brings you to Red Bluff? James dismounted, keeping his hands visible. Your brother sent me. He's been trying to find you for months. Clara looked at Lucas in surprise. He had never mentioned having a brother. Lucas's expression was unreadable. What does Matthew want? He needs your help, James replied. The man who burned your ranch, Barrett Jenkins, is making another play for the water rights in the valley. He's got backing from some Eastern investors now, buying up land all around the Double C. A muscle ticked in Lucas's jaw. Matthew has a ranch of his own. He can handle Jenkins. Not alone he can't, James insisted. Jenkins has hired guns now, professional troublemakers. 3 ranchers have already sold out after mysterious accidents. He glanced at Clara. Sound familiar? Lucas followed his gaze to Clara, something complicated passing across his features. You've heard about our situation here. James nodded. Word travels. That's partly why we came. Matthew thought you might need reinforcements too. He gestured toward the 2 riders waiting down the road. We're at your disposal. Clara touched Lucas's arm lightly. Lucas, who is this? What's happening? Lucas sighed. Clara Galloway, meet James Cooper. He works for my brother's ranch in Wyoming, the Double C Cooper and Company. He turned back to James. And this is Clara Galloway. Her father was murdered by Elias Walton over water rights, just like Jenkins did with Sarah. Understanding dawned in James's eyes as he tipped his hat to Clara. Miss Galloway, I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Clara replied automatically, her mind still processing this new information about Lucas. You said there are 3 of you. Yes, madam. Myself and 2 hands from the Double C who know their way around trouble. James looked back at Lucas. Matthew said to tell you he's sorry for how things ended between you. He wants to make it right. Lucas's expression softened slightly. It wasn't his fault. I wasn't thinking clearly after Sarah died. Will you help him? James asked. After we help you here, of course. Lucas looked at Clara, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding that he needed to face this part of his past. We'll discuss it, Lucas told James. For now, bring your men up to the cabin. You look like you could use some coffee and breakfast. As James went to signal his companions, Clara drew Lucas aside. You never told me about your brother. We had a falling out after Sarah died, Lucas explained quietly. He thought I was being reckless, seeking revenge against Jenkins without proof or planning. He was right, but I didn't want to hear it then. Clara squeezed his arm gently. And now, Lucas looked toward the approaching riders. Now I think I've had enough time to see things more clearly, and maybe having some experienced help against Walton wouldn't be the worst thing. James returned with his companions, who introduced themselves as Tom Blackburn and Frank Murphy, weather-beaten men with the hardened look of long-time ranch hands who'd seen their share of trouble. They tied their horses to the hitching post and accepted Clara's invitation to breakfast with grateful nods. Over coffee and biscuits, they shared what they knew about Walton's operations and the similarities to Jenkins's tactics in Wyoming. Clara was struck by the parallels, both men using intimidation and violence to control water access, both seemingly untouchable due to their wealth and connections. Jenkins and Walton might even be working together, Tom suggested. These Eastern investors James mentioned they could be backing both operations. It's possible, Lucas agreed. There's been a pattern of this across the territory's wealthy interests, using figureheads like Walton to consolidate control of natural resources. Clara considered this broader perspective. So this isn't just about my father's claim or your ranch. It's happening everywhere. More or less, Frank confirmed. But folks are starting to fight back, not just individually but together. That's what Matthew is trying to organize in Wyoming, James added. A coalition of smaller ranchers and farmers standing united against Jenkins and his backers. Lucas looked thoughtful. And you think we could do the same here in Red Bluff? Why not? James replied. You said there are other independent miners and small operators who resent Walton's control. If you could bring them together. Clara felt a spark of hope ignite within her. It could work. People respected my father. If we could show them a way to stand up to Walton without facing him alone. They spent the morning developing a strategy. James and his companions would provide additional security for the claim, allowing Lucas to spend more time in town recruiting support among the townspeople and neighboring claim holders. Clara would continue managing the business aspects, documenting Walton's threats and illegal activities to build a case they could eventually take to the territorial authorities. As the men discussed logistics, Clara found herself watching Lucas. The arrival of James and the news of his brother had transformed him subtly. There was new energy in his movements, a sense of purpose beyond just protecting her claim. She realized with a pang that once Walton was dealt with, Lucas might leave to help his brother in Wyoming. The thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit. In the short time they'd known each other, Lucas had become essential to her world not just as protection against Walton, but as a companion, a support, and increasingly, something more. Later that day, as Lucas prepared to ride into town with James to begin recruiting allies, Clara walked with him to the horses. Be careful, she urged. Walton will have eyes everywhere. I know, Lucas assured her. We'll be discreet. Tom and Frank will stay here with you. They know what they're doing. Clara nodded, then impulsively caught his hand. Lucas, she hesitated, uncertain how to express the jumble of emotions she was feeling. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her face, his blue eyes softening. I'll come back, Clara, I promise. I know you will, she said softly. It's just, I wanted to thank you for everything you've done since that first day. Lucas gently squeezed her hand. You don't need to thank me. I'm where I need to be. The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest as Lucas mounted his horse and rode out with James, turning back once to wave before they disappeared around the bend in the road. The following days brought a flurry of activity as their plan took shape. Lucas and James made progress in town, carefully approaching potential allies and building a network of support. Several of the miners who had attended Josiah's funeral agreed to join their coalition, along with a few small business owners who had suffered under Walton's economic control of the town. At the claim, Clara worked with Tom and Frank to improve their defenses, establishing a rotation of lookouts and identifying the best positions from which to protect the cabin and the spring. In the evenings, when Lucas returned, they would gather around the table to share information and refine their strategy. Clara found herself growing increasingly comfortable with their unlikely household. Tom proved to be an excellent cook, taking over kitchen duties with surprising enthusiasm. Frank had a talent for storytelling, entertaining them with tales of his adventures across the frontier. And James, with his easy manner and quick wit, brought a lightheartedness that helped balance the seriousness of their situation. But it was Lucas who remained the center of Clara's attention. Each day, she discovered new facets of his character, his patience when explaining the mechanics of the sluice box, his quiet humor when Frank's stories grew too outlandish, his unwavering focus when discussing tactics against Walton. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster and her cheeks flush with warmth. 2 weeks after James and the others had arrived, their first real confrontation with Walton's forces came. Clara was working at the sluice box, Frank keeping watch nearby, when the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention. "Company coming," Frank called, moving quickly to position himself between Clara and the approach road. Clara grabbed her revolver from its holster and hurried toward the cabin, where Tom was already on the porch with a rifle. Lucas and James had ridden into town that morning and weren't expected back until evening. "How many?" she asked Tom as she reached the porch. "6, maybe 7 riders," he replied grimly. "Moving fast." Clara's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Let them come, we're ready." The riders appeared around the bend in the road, Walton himself at their head. They pulled up about 100 yards from the cabin, spreading out in a line that effectively blocked the road. "Miss Galloway," Walton called, "I see you've hired some protection. How resourceful of you." Clara stepped forward, keeping herself partially shielded by one of the porch posts. "What do you want, Walton?" "Just a friendly visit," he replied with false joviality. "I wanted to see how you're managing the claim without your father's expertise. It must be challenging for a young woman." "I'm managing just fine," Clara called back. "As you can see." Walton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. Though I couldn't help noticing you've been diverting more water than your rights allow. That's a serious violation, Miss Galloway." Clara's grip tightened on her revolver. It was a blatant lie. They had been scrupulously careful about water usage, precisely to avoid giving Walton any legitimate grievance. "That's not true, and you know it," she replied firmly. "Our water usage is exactly as specified in the deed." "Well, that's a matter of interpretation, isn't it?" Walton gestured to one of his men, who produced an official-looking document. "I have here an order from Judge Phillips requiring an inspection of your water diversion equipment. We're here to conduct that inspection." Tom stepped forward, rifle held casually but ready. "Judge Phillips is in your pocket, Walton. Everyone knows that." "Nevertheless, it's a legal order," Walton insisted. "Refusing to comply would be obstruction, a jailable offense." Clara's mind raced. This was clearly a pretext to gain access to the claim, possibly to sabotage their equipment or plant evidence of some violation. But refusing outright would give Walton the excuse he needed to have her arrested. "The order may be legal," she conceded, "but I have the right to have my own representative present during any inspection. I'll need to send for Mr. Nash." Walton's expression darkened. "Nash isn't a lawyer or an official of any kind. He has no standing here." "He's my business partner," Clara improvised. "And as such, he has every right to be present when my property is inspected. Unless you'd prefer we consult with the Territorial Marshal's office about the legality of this order." It was a bluff. The nearest marshal was days away, but Clara delivered it with confident authority. Walton clearly hadn't expected such composed resistance. After a tense moment, he shrugged elaborately. "By all means, send for Nash. We'll conduct the inspection tomorrow at noon. But be warned, Miss Galloway, any attempt to alter your equipment or water flow before then will be noted and added to the violations." "Nothing will be altered," Clara assured him coldly. "We have nothing to hide." Walton tipped his hat with mock courtesy. "Until tomorrow, then." As they rode away, Clara's knees nearly buckled with relief. Frank hurried to her side, steadying her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "That was well handled, Miss Galloway," he said admiringly. "You bought us time." "Yes," Tom agreed, lowering his rifle. But we need to get word to Lucas and James right away. They need to know what's happening. I'll ride to town, Frank volunteered. I can find them faster than anyone, Clara nodded. Be careful. Walton might have men watching the road. As Frank rode out, Clara and Tom inspected their water diversion equipment, confirming that everything was exactly as specified in their water rights. There was nothing Walton could legitimately object to, but Clara knew that wouldn't stop him from manufacturing violations. "What do you think he's really after?" she asked Tom as they walked back to the cabin. "Creating a pretext," Tom replied grimly. "If he can get the judge to rule that you've violated water usage regulations, he could have your rights restricted or even revoked entirely. Then he'd swoop in to rescue the situation by buying the claim at a fraction of its value." Clara's jaw tightened. "We won't let that happen." By the time Lucas and James returned with Frank, Clara had formulated a plan. They gathered around the cabin's table as she laid out her thinking. "Walton expects us to be on the defensive tomorrow," she explained. "He thinks we'll be scrambling to counter whatever false violations he invents. But what if we turn the tables?" Lucas leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "Davies and the other miners who have joined our coalition, they all depend on water access. What if they all show up tomorrow as well? Not just to support us, but to officially witness the inspection as interested parties." A slow smile spread across Lucas's face. "With multiple independent witnesses, Walton can't just make up violations without contradiction." "Exactly," Clara said, warming to her idea. "And more than that, it shows Walton that we're not alone, that there's a united front forming against him." "It's risky," James cautioned. "Walton could see it as a challenge to his authority, escalate things." "He's going to escalate regardless," Tom pointed out. "At least this way we set the terms of the confrontation." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "I think Clara's right. It's time to show our hand at least partially." "James and I made good progress in town today. Several more business owners have agreed to join our coalition. If we can demonstrate that standing together works, then others might find their courage as well," Clara finished. They spent the evening refining the plan. Lucas and James would ride out at first light to gather their allies, bringing them to the claim before Walton's noon deadline. Tom and Frank would prepare defensive positions, just in case the situation turned violent. Clara would review all their legal documentation, ensuring they were fully prepared to counter any false claims. As the others turned in for the night, Clara found herself too keyed up to sleep. She stepped outside onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air and gazing up at the star-filled sky. The distant mountains were silver-tipped in the moonlight, the stream a ribbon of liquid silver across their property. The sound of the door opening behind her announced Lucas's presence before he spoke. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her at the porch railing. Clara shook her head. "Too much thinking." "Second thoughts about tomorrow?" "No," she said firmly. "It's the right move. I'm just—" She hesitated, searching for the words. "Afraid," Lucas suggested gently. Clara considered this. "Not exactly afraid, more aware of how much is at stake. Not just for us, but for everyone who's decided to stand with us." Lucas nodded in understanding. "That's leadership, Clara, feeling the weight of responsibility for others." "I never asked to be a leader," she said with a small smile. "I just wanted to honor my father's wishes." "Sometimes leadership finds us, whether we're looking for it or not." Lucas turned to face her fully. "You're stronger than you realize, Clara Galloway. I've watched you these past weeks, handling grief that would have broken many, standing up to threats that would have sent others running. You're remarkable." The simple sincerity in his voice made Clara's breath catch. She looked up at him, at the way the moonlight silvered his features and reflected in his eyes, and felt something shift between them, a boundary crossed, a possibility acknowledged. "I couldn't have done any of it without you," she said softly. Lucas shook his head. "You would have found a way. It's who you are." His voice lowered. "But I'm glad I was here to see it." Clara's heart pounded as he reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm and gentle. "Clara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," she whispered, scarcely breathing. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as though memorizing her features. Then, with exquisite slowness, he bent his head and touched his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and brief, but it sent waves of warmth cascading through Clara's body. When Lucas started to pull back, she instinctively followed, her hand coming up to rest against his chest as she returned the kiss with newfound certainty. This time when they parted, Lucas's arms had somehow found their way around her waist, and Clara's hands were resting on his shoulders. They remained that way, close and breathing each other's air, neither wanting to break the moment. "I didn't come to Red Bluff looking for this," Lucas murmured. "For you, nor I for you," Clara replied. "But here we are," he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his serious features. "Here we are indeed." They might have said more, explored this new territory between them further, but the sound of a door closing inside the cabin reminded them of their precarious situation and the challenges awaiting them tomorrow. Lucas reluctantly stepped back, though he kept hold of her hand. "We should try to rest. Tomorrow will demand all our strength." Clara nodded, though she was certain sleep would be even more elusive now. "Lucas," she said as he turned to go, "whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad you sat with me that day when I couldn't speak." He squeezed her hand gently. "So am I, Clara, more than I can say." Morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that belied the tension pervading the claim. Clara dressed with particular care, choosing her most practical but presentable dress, a dark blue cotton that allowed freedom of movement while still conveying a sense of propriety. She braided her hair tightly and checked that her revolver was loaded before tucking it into the pocket of her apron. By 10 o'clock, Lucas and James had returned with their allies Davies and 5 other miners, the general store owner and his wife, and to Clara's surprise, Dr. Simmons and Pastor Williams. They gathered in the yard between the cabin and the stream, a diverse group united by their determination to stand against Walton's tyranny. "Thank you all for coming," Clara addressed them. "Your presence here means more than I can express." Pastor Williams stepped forward. "Your father was a good man, Miss Galloway. What happened to him wasn't right, and neither is what Walton's trying to do to you now." Dr. Simmons nodded in agreement. "Some of us have been too complacent for too long. It's time to take a stand." Clara was touched by their support. As they discussed the plan for Walton's arrival, she noticed Lucas moving among the group, speaking quietly with each person, assessing their resolve and calming their nerves. He had a natural leadership quality that drew people to him, and yet he deferred to Clara in matters concerning the claim, reinforcing her authority without diminishing his own. It was nearly noon when the lookout Frank had posted on the rise above the cabin signaled Walton's approach. Clara took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and moved to the front of their assembled group, Lucas a steady presence at her side. Walton appeared around the bend in the road, leading a larger contingent than the day before, at least 10 men, including the local sheriff, a nervous-looking man named Parker who owed his position to Walton's influence. They pulled up short at the sight of the gathered crowd awaiting them. "What's the meaning of this?" Walton demanded as he dismounted. This was to be an official inspection, not a public spectacle. Clara stepped forward. "These are all interested parties, Mr. Walton, stakeholders in the water rights you claim I'm abusing." They have every right to witness this inspection. Sheriff Parker looked distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. Walton, she's within her rights. We can't prevent people from being on private property if the owner invites them. Walton shot him a venomous look before composing his features into a false smile. Of course, of course. The more witnesses to Miss Galloway's violations, the better. There are no violations, Clara stated firmly, but please proceed with your inspection. We have nothing to hide. What followed was a methodical examination of the Galloway claim's water diversion system. Clara had prepared well, having documentation of water usage and the original survey marks that established their rights. At every turn, when Walton or his hired expert attempted to claim some discrepancy, she or one of the miners would produce evidence contradicting the assertion. The inspection dragged on for over an hour, with Walton growing increasingly frustrated as his pretexts evaporated one by one. Finally, standing by the main diversion point where the stream was partially channeled for their use, he made his last attempt. The flow rate here clearly exceeds the specified limit, he declared, pointing to the water rushing through the wooden sluice. Davies stepped forward. Begging your pardon, but that's not correct. I helped Josiah build this sluice last spring, and we calibrated it precisely to the specifications in the deed. Are you an engineer, Mr. Davies? Walton sneered. No, but I am, Dr. Simmons interjected, surprising everyone. Before turning to medicine, I studied civil engineering back east, and I can assure you this diversion is exactly to specification. Walton's face flushed with anger. He turned to Sheriff Parker. This is a waste of time. These people have clearly tampered with the equipment before our arrival. That's a serious accusation, Lucas said, his voice dangerously quiet. Do you have any evidence to support it? I don't need evidence, Walton snapped. I know actually, you do need evidence, Pastor Williams interrupted calmly, especially when making accusations before so many witnesses. Walton looked around at the assembled faces, seeming to realize for the first time that he had lost control of the situation. These were people who had feared him for years, who had averted their eyes when he passed on the street. Now they were standing firm, meeting his gaze without flinching. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Walton adjusted his hat with deliberate slowness. It seems I was misinformed about the extent of the water usage here, a simple misunderstanding. He turned to Sheriff Parker. I see no violations worthy of further action at this time. Sheriff Parker looked relieved. Then we're done here. For now, Walton agreed, his tone making the implicit threat clear. As Walton and his men prepared to depart, he paused beside Clara and Lucas. This isn't over, Miss Galloway, he said quietly. You've won a skirmish, not the war. Perhaps, Clara replied steadily. But now you know we're not fighting alone. Walton's eyes narrowed. Allies can be fickle, especially when pressure is applied in the right places. Remember that. With that parting threat, he mounted his horse and led his men back toward town, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Once Walton was out of sight, a collective release of breath seemed to pass through the gathered allies. Then Davies let out a whoop of triumph, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, clapping each other on the back and congratulating Clara and Lucas on their successful strategy. That went better than I dared hope, Lucas said quietly to Clara as they watched their supporters celebrate. He'll retaliate, Clara replied, not allowing herself to be swept up in the momentary victory. And soon, Lucas nodded. Yes, but not the way he planned. We've forced him to change tactics, which means he'll be reacting to us rather than the other way around. That gives us an advantage. They invited everyone to stay for a meal, and the afternoon transformed into an impromptu gathering of their growing coalition. As food and drink were shared, strategies discussed, and stories exchanged, Clara was struck by the sense of community that had emerged from their common cause. These people, many of whom had barely acknowledged each other before, were now united in purpose. As the sun began to set, their guests departed in small groups, each promising to spread the word of what had happened and to remain vigilant for Walton's next move. Soon only Clara, Lucas, and their 3 companions from Wyoming remained at the claim. "What now?" James asked as they cleared away the remains of the meal. Lucas looked to Clara, deferring to her judgment. She considered the question carefully. "Now we prepare for Walton's response," she decided. "He won't wait long, and he'll want to make an example of us to discourage others." "We should move into town," Lucas suggested. "At least some of us. Be visible, keep our allies engaged. The more public support we maintain, the harder it will be for Walton to move against us without consequences." They agreed that Lucas and James would spend more time in Red Bluff, while Tom and Frank remained at the claim with Clara. The arrangement was practical, but Clara found herself disappointed at the prospect of Lucas being away for extended periods. After their kiss on the porch, something had shifted between them, a new awareness that made even their casual interactions charged with unspoken meaning. That evening, as the others turned in, Clara and Lucas once again found themselves on the porch, drawn to each other in the quiet of the night. "I wish you didn't have to go to town," Clara admitted softly. Lucas's hand found hers in the darkness. "It won't be for long, just enough to maintain momentum with our allies." "I know it's necessary," she said. "It's just—" "What?" Lucas prompted when she didn't continue. Clara turned to face him. "I've grown accustomed to having you near, to knowing you're just across the yard if I need you." The admission cost her something in pride, but the way Lucas's expression softened made it worthwhile. "I've grown accustomed to being near you too," he confessed, his voice low and intimate. "More than I should have, perhaps." Clara's heart quickened. "What do you mean?" Lucas sighed, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "I came to Red Bluff with no intentions of staying. I've been drifting for 2 years, never putting down roots, and yet here I am, involved not just in your fight against Walton, but in—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "In what?" Clara whispered. "In you," he said simply. "In caring for you in a way I didn't think I could care for anyone again after Sarah." The raw honesty in his voice moved Clara deeply. Without hesitation, she stepped closer and rested her hand against his cheek. "I care for you too, Lucas, more than I can properly express." This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no holding back. Lucas's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as Clara wound her arms around his neck. The kiss deepened, expressing all the emotions they had held in check during the tense days of preparing for Walton's inspection. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he murmured, "when Walton is no longer a threat, we should talk about what comes next." Clara nodded, her heart full of possibilities she hadn't dared consider before. "Yes, we should." The following days brought a flurry of activity as their coalition solidified and expanded. Lucas and James spent most daylight hours in town, returning to the claim each evening with reports of growing support. More business owners had joined their cause, along with additional miners, and even a few of the smaller ranchers from the surrounding area who had suffered under Walton's water pricing. They established a system of communication messengers who could quickly spread word if Walton made a move against any of their allies. Supplies were stockpiled, defensive positions prepared, and escape routes planned for vulnerable members of the coalition. Through it all, Clara found herself growing into the leadership role that circumstances had thrust upon her. She became the central point of coordination, making decisions that affected not just her claim but the broader resistance to Walton's control. It was a responsibility she hadn't sought but found. She had an aptitude for her father's practical nature, combined with her mother's compassion, giving her a balanced approach that earned respect from even the most skeptical allies. Walton, for his part, seemed to be biding his time. His men maintained a visible presence in town, occasionally harassing coalition members with minor provocations, but stopping short of outright violence. The uneasy stalemate lasted nearly 2 weeks before Walton finally made his move. It began with a fire at Davies's claim in the middle of the night. A small outbuilding burned to the ground while Davies and his partner barely escaped their cabin. The next day, the general store owner found his latest shipment of supplies mysteriously lost on the road from Denver. Then Pastor Williams's church was vandalized. Biblical texts about obedience to authority painted crudely across the walls. Each incident was carefully orchestrated to appear unconnected to Walton, with no direct evidence of his involvement. But the pattern was clear. He was targeting coalition members one by one, testing their resolve and their unity. "He's trying to divide us," Clara observed as they gathered at the claim to discuss the escalating situation. "Make each attack seem isolated, hope that fear will erode our alliance." "It's working to some extent," Lucas admitted grimly. "A few of the smaller business owners have withdrawn their support. They can't afford the losses." "We need to respond," James urged. "Show Walton and the town that we won't be intimidated." "But how?" Davies asked, his face still haggard from the shock of the fire. "We can't prove Walton's behind these incidents, and we can't just start shooting up the town in retaliation." Clara had been quiet, listening to the discussion while an idea formed in her mind. "What if we don't respond with violence at all?" she suggested. "What if we respond with public solidarity?" All eyes turned to her. "What do you have in mind?" Lucas asked. "A town meeting," Clara proposed. "Open to everyone, held in the church once it's cleaned up. We publicly declare our coalition and our demands: fair water rights for all, an end to Walton's monopolistic practices, and an investigation into my father's murder." "Walton would never attend such a meeting," Davies objected. "He wouldn't have to," Clara explained, her excitement growing as the plan took shape. "The point isn't to confront Walton directly, it's to show the entire town that we're organized, unified, and reasonable in our demands, to give others the courage to join us." Lucas nodded slowly, understanding her strategy. "And if Walton tries to disrupt the meeting or prevent it from happening, then he exposes himself as the tyrant we know him to be," Clara finished. "Either way, we gain ground." The proposal was debated thoroughly, with some coalition members expressing concern about making themselves such visible targets. But ultimately, the majority agreed that Clara's approach offered their best chance of shifting public opinion decisively against Walton. They set the meeting for Sunday afternoon, following Pastor Williams's regular service. The timing was deliberate. More townspeople would already be at church, and Walton would be less likely to use violence on the Sabbath with so many witnesses present. The days leading up to the meeting were tense but productive. Clara worked with Lucas and Pastor Williams to craft a formal declaration of principles and demands. James and the others quietly spread word throughout Red Bluff and the surrounding claims, encouraging attendance while maintaining secrecy about the full scope of their plans. On the morning of the meeting, Clara woke early, her mind too active for sleep. She dressed with care in her best dress, a dark green wool that had been her mother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit her. As she pinned her father's watch to her bodice, she felt a sense of their presence with her, supporting her in the stand she was about to take. Lucas knocked softly at her door as she was arranging her hair. "Ready?" he asked when she opened it. Clara nodded, though her stomach fluttered with nerves. "As ready as I'll ever be." He studied her for a moment, then reached out to gently touch the watch pinned to her dress. "Your father would be proud of you today." The simple statement steadied her more than any elaborate reassurance could have. "Thank you," she said softly. They rode into town together, accompanied by James, Tom, and Frank. The streets of Red Bluff were unusually busy for a Sunday morning, with people making their way toward the church at the edge of town. Clara noticed several of Walton's men watching from the shadows of the saloon, their expressions alert and suspicious. Pastor Williams greeted them at the church door, his face showing the strain of recent events but his eyes clear and determined. "Good morning, Miss Galloway. Mr. Nash. We're nearly ready. The service will begin shortly, and I've announced the town meeting to follow." The church was fuller than Clara had ever seen it, with people crowded into pews and standing along the walls. She recognized coalition members scattered throughout the congregation, strategically positioned to help maintain order if needed. Lucas guided her to a seat near the front, while James and the others remained near the entrance, watching for trouble. The service proceeded normally, though Clara found it hard to focus on Pastor Williams's sermon about courage and standing firm in the face of adversity. Her mind kept returning to the speech she would soon deliver, mentally rehearsing key points and anticipating possible reactions. When the service concluded, there was a brief shuffle as some parishioners departed while others arrived specifically for the town meeting. Clara noted with satisfaction that the church remained nearly full, a testament to the growing interest in their cause. Pastor Williams called the meeting to order, briefly explaining its purpose before introducing Clara as the primary speaker. A hush fell over the congregation as she made her way to the front, Lucas following to stand supportively at her side. Clara took a deep breath, surveying the sea of faces before her. Friends and allies, curious onlookers, and yes, even a few of Walton's men who had slipped in to observe. She began to speak, her voice low at first but gathering strength with each word. "Many of you knew my father, Josiah Galloway," she started. "You knew him as a fair man, a hard worker, someone who believed in the promise of this frontier and in building a community where all could prosper, not just the wealthy and powerful." Heads nodded throughout the congregation, encouraging her to continue. "3 weeks ago, my father was murdered in the street, shot down in cold blood for refusing to sell his water rights to Elias Walton." Clara paused, letting the blunt statement hang in the air. There was no investigation, no charges filed. Because in Red Bluff, justice has become a commodity that Walton controls, just like he controls the water, the supplies, and increasingly, the very air we breathe. A murmur ran through the crowd, some in agreement, others in discomfort at the directness of her accusation. "But today," Clara continued, her voice strengthening, "today we declare that enough is enough. We stand together, miners, merchants, ranchers, and townspeople, to reclaim our community from fear and corruption." She proceeded to outline their coalition's principles and demands, emphasizing their commitment to fair access to resources, transparent governance, and justice for those who had suffered under Walton's regime. As she spoke, she could sense the mood of the gathering shifting, resistance giving way to consideration and, in many cases, active support. When she finished, Pastor Williams invited others to speak. One by one, coalition members rose to share their experiences of Walton's intimidation and exploitation. Davies described the fire at his claim. The general store owner detailed how Walton's control of supply routes had forced him to raise prices against his will. Dr. Simmons explained how medical supplies had been restricted to those who supported Walton's interests. The cumulative effect was powerful, a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse of power that had affected nearly everyone in Red Bluff in some way. As the testimonies continued, Clara noticed movement at the back of the church. The doors had opened, and Elias Walton himself stood framed in the entrance, flanked by several of his men. A tense silence fell over the gathering. Walton advanced slowly down the center aisle, his heavy footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet church. He stopped a few paces from where Clara stood, removing his hat in a gesture that managed to be both courteous and mocking. "Miss Galloway," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the building. "What an impressive performance! I commend your oratorical skills." Clara held her ground, aware of Lucas tensing beside her. "This is not a performance, Mr. Walton. These are legitimate grievances from the people of Red Bluff." "Grievances," Walton repeated, looking around at the assembled faces with an expression of wounded innocence. "I've done nothing but bring prosperity to this town. I've invested my own fortune in developing resources that benefit everyone." "At what cost?" Lucas challenged, stepping forward. "Extortion, intimidation, murder." Walton's face hardened. "Careful, Nash. Slander is a serious offense." "It's not slander if it's true," Clara countered. "And we have documentation of your methods. Records of water rights manipulated, statements from people you've threatened, witnesses to my father's murder who are now willing to testify." This was partially a bluff. They had some evidence, but not the comprehensive case Clara implied. Still, the sudden uncertainty in Walton's expression suggested it had hit its mark. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Galloway," Walton warned. "One that could have serious consequences for you and your supporters." His gaze swept meaningfully over the congregation. "We're not afraid anymore," Clara declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's what this meeting is about, standing together against the fear you've used to control this town." A murmur of agreement rose from the gathered townspeople, growing in volume as more voices joined in. Walton glanced around, clearly unsettled by the show of solidarity. Before he could respond, the church doors burst open again. Sheriff Parker stumbled in, his face pale with urgency. "Fire!" he shouted. "There's a fire at the Galloway claim." Clara's heart froze. "What?" "Someone set fire to the cabin," Parker explained breathlessly. "It's spreading fast toward the spring." Lucas grabbed Clara's arm as her knees threatened to buckle. "When?" he demanded of Parker. "Who reported this?" "Just now," Parker replied. "One of the miners spotted it on his way to town." Clara turned to Walton, fury replacing her shock. "This is your doing." Walton spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "I've been here in town all morning, as dozens of witnesses can attest. How could I possibly be responsible?" "You don't have to hold the torch yourself to be guilty," Lucas growled. Without waiting for Walton's response, Lucas turned to James. "Get the horses. We need to move now." The meeting dissolved into chaos as people rushed to respond to the emergency. Many of the miners and townspeople volunteered to help fight the fire, while others remained to prevent Walton from leaving until the situation was clarified. Clara, Lucas, and their companions raced back to the claim, joined by a hastily organized bucket brigade from town. As they crested the final rise, Clara's worst fears were confirmed. Her father's cabin was engulfed in flames, and the fire had indeed spread to the surrounding brush, threatening the critical spring that was the source of their water rights. For the next several hours, they fought desperately to contain the blaze. The cabin was beyond saving, but they managed to protect the spring and prevent the fire from spreading to neighboring claims. By late afternoon, exhausted and smoke-stained, they surveyed the damage. "Everything's gone," Clara said hollowly, staring at the charred remains of what had been her home. All my father's papers, our family keepsakes, everything. Lucas put his arm around her shoulders. Not everything, he said gently. The spring is intact, the water rights remain. And we have copies of the most important documents in town with Dr. Simmons. Clara leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. This was Walton's answer to our meeting. He wants us to know he can take everything from us. Not everything, Lucas repeated firmly. Not our resolve. Not each other. As the volunteers from town gradually departed, Clara, Lucas, and their companions established a makeshift camp near the spring. The destruction of the cabin was a severe blow, but Clara refused to be driven from the claim. "We'll rebuild," she declared that evening as they sat around a small fire. "Stronger than before, and in the meantime, we'll continue organizing in town." "Walton will expect us to retreat after this," James observed, "to lick our wounds and abandon the coalition." "Then we'll disappoint him," Clara replied with quiet determination. "Tomorrow, I'll go back to town and speak with every person who attended that meeting. I'll show them that not even this," she gestured toward the ruins of the cabin, "can break our spirit." Lucas studied her with admiration. "Walton doesn't understand what he's up against. He thinks in terms of property and power. He doesn't comprehend the strength that comes from conviction." Clara met his gaze across the fire, drawing courage from his unwavering faith in her. "Tomorrow," she promised, "we take the fight back to him." True to her word, Clara returned to town the following day, her appearance creating a sensation as she walked openly down the main street in her smoke-stained dress, head held high despite the destruction of her home. Word of the fire had spread quickly, and people emerged from shops and houses to witness her defiant return. She spoke with everyone who would listen, transforming what Walton had intended as a devastating setback into a rallying point for the coalition. By midday, offers of assistance had begun to pour in: lumber for rebuilding the cabin, temporary lodging at the boarding house, donations of household goods to replace what had been lost in the fire. Most significantly, several prominent citizens who had previously remained neutral now openly declared their support for the coalition. The blatant attack on a young woman's property, timed to coincide with the town meeting, had crossed a line that even the most cautious found impossible to ignore. By evening, when Clara reunited with Lucas at the temporary camp they had established near the spring, she was exhausted but triumphant. "Walton miscalculated," she reported as they shared a simple meal. "The fire has turned more people against him than a dozen meetings could have." Lucas nodded. "I've heard the same from James and the others. There's talk of petitioning the territorial governor to send a marshal to investigate Walton's activities." Clara's eyes widened. "That would be a significant step. You think it could succeed?" "With enough signatures and the evidence we've gathered, it's possible." Lucas hesitated, then continued more seriously. "But Walton will sense that he's losing control. That makes him more dangerous than ever." "What do you think he'll do?" Lucas considered this, his expression grim. "He'll try to eliminate what he sees as the source of his problems." "Me," Clara stated simply. "And me," Lucas added. "And anyone else he identifies as a leader of the resistance." He reached across to take her hand. "We need to be extremely careful in the coming days." The warning proved prescient. That night, they heard riders approaching the claim shortly after midnight. Thanks to the lookout system they had established, they were able to withdraw to a defensive position in the rocks overlooking the spring before Walton's men arrived. From their vantage point, they watched as 6 armed men searched the campsite, clearly frustrated to find it deserted. After a brief consultation, the men set fire to their remaining supplies before departing. "They're getting desperate," Tom observed as they watched the small blaze from a safe distance. coming in the night like common bandits. Walton's losing control of the town, Lucas agreed. He's falling back on brute force. Clara shivered, partly from the night chill and partly from the realization of how close they had come to being ambushed in their sleep. "We can't stay here," she acknowledged reluctantly. "It's too exposed." "We'll move to Davies's claim tomorrow," Lucas decided. "He has better defensive positions, and it's closer to town." The relocation proved wise. Over the next several days, tension in Red Bluff escalated rapidly. Walton's men maintained an intimidating presence in town, while coalition members moved in groups for safety. Sheriff Parker, caught between his loyalty to Walton and the shifting public opinion, made himself scarce, effectively leaving the town without law enforcement. The petition to the territorial governor circulated quietly, gathering signatures despite Walton's efforts to intercept it. Clara spent most of her time at Davies's claim, coordinating the coalition's activities and planning the rebuilding of her cabin. Lucas divided his time between protecting Clara and maintaining their network of allies in town. Their personal relationship deepened amid the crisis. The shared danger and common purpose forged a bond between them that transcended their initial attraction. In stolen moments between strategy sessions and security preparations, they found time for quiet conversations about their hopes for the future beyond the conflict with Walton. "What will you do when this is over?" Clara asked one evening as they sat together on the porch of Davies's cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Lucas was silent for a long moment. "I received a letter from my brother yesterday," he finally said. "The situation in Wyoming is getting worse. Jenkins has hired more gunmen, threatened more ranchers." Clara's heart constricted. "You need to go to him." Lucas turned to her, his expression serious. "Not without resolving matters here first, and not without—" He hesitated. "Not without knowing where we stand, you and I." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I think you know where my heart lies, Lucas." He reached for her hand. "I do, as I hope you know mine. But there are practical considerations. Your life is here with your father's claim. My brother needs me in Wyoming." "Perhaps there's a third option," Clara suggested softly. "One that doesn't require either of us to abandon what's important." Before Lucas could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. They tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but relaxed when they recognized James and Frank returning from town. The news they brought was urgent. Walton had somehow learned of the petition and had ordered his men to arrest anyone found with a copy, on charges of sedition and conspiracy. Several coalition members had already been detained in the makeshift jail behind the sheriff's office. "This is his end game," Lucas realized. "He's trying to decapitate the coalition before the petition reaches the territorial capital." "We need to free those who have been arrested," Clara declared, "and ensure the petition gets through." They quickly formulated a plan. James would take the petition and make a run for the territorial capital, escorted by Frank for protection. Meanwhile, Lucas, Tom, and several trusted coalition members would create a diversion that would allow Clara and Davies to free the prisoners from the jail. The plan was set in motion at dawn the following day. James and Frank departed quietly, taking a circuitous route to avoid Walton's patrols. Lucas and his group positioned themselves at various points around Red Bluff, ready to create commotion that would draw Walton's men away from the sheriff's office. Clara and Davies waited at the edge of town, watching for the signal. A series of small fires set in predetermined locations that would require immediate attention. When the first plume of smoke rose from the livery stable, followed quickly by others at the lumber yard and behind the saloon, they knew it was time to move. They approached the sheriff's office cautiously, finding it guarded by only a single man, the others having rushed to deal with the fires. Davies engaged him in conversation while Clara slipped around to the rear entrance of the jail. Inside, she found 4 coalition members confined in 2 cells, along with Sheriff Parker, who appeared to have been locked up as well after apparently having a crisis of conscience. "Miss Galloway," Parker whispered urgently, "you shouldn't be here. Walton's ordered his men to shoot coalition leaders on sight." "Then I'd better not be seen," Clara replied as she searched for the cell keys. "What happened to you, Sheriff?" Parker looked ashamed. "I refused to sign arrest warrants for people whose only crime was signing a petition. Walton had his men lock me up too, said I was temporarily unfit for duty." Clara found the keys hanging on a hook behind the desk and quickly freed the prisoners. "We need to move fast," she urged them. "The diversion won't last long." They exited through the rear door, making their way toward the church where Pastor Williams was waiting to provide temporary sanctuary. As they crossed an alleyway between buildings, shots suddenly rang out, splintering the wooden wall beside Clara's head. "Run!" she shouted, pushing the freed prisoners ahead of her while Sheriff Parker drew his revolver and returned fire. They scattered, running in different directions to confuse their pursuers. Clara sprinted toward the general store, hoping to cut through to the side street beyond. As she rounded the corner, she collided heavily with someone, Elias Walton himself. Walton recovered quickly, grabbing her arm in a vise-like grip. "Miss Galloway," he snarled. "How convenient." Clara struggled, but his strength far exceeded hers. "Let me go," she demanded, reaching for the small derringer in her pocket. Walton twisted her arm painfully, causing her to gasp. "I think not. You've been a thorn in my side for too long." He began dragging her toward the alley, away from potential witnesses. Clara fought desperately, kicking and clawing as he pulled her into the shadows between buildings. She managed to free her hand enough to grasp the derringer, but before she could bring it to bear, Walton slammed her against the wall, knocking the small gun from her grasp. "You should have taken my offer for your father's claim," Walton growled, his face inches from hers. "Now you'll get nothing, and once you're gone, your coalition will fall apart." Clara refused to show fear, meeting his gaze defiantly despite the terror coursing through her. "You're wrong. It's bigger than me now. Even if you kill me, you've already lost Red Bluff." Walton's face contorted with rage. He reached for the pistol at his belt, but before he could draw it, a voice spoke from the entrance to the alley. "Let her go, Walton. Now." Lucas stood silhouetted against the morning light, his gun already drawn and aimed steadily at Walton's head. Walton froze, then slowly smiled. "Nash, I was wondering when you'd appear." Without releasing Clara, he shifted position slightly to use her as a shield. "Quite a predicament, isn't it? You can't shoot me without risking her." "I'm not going to shoot you," Lucas replied evenly. "At least not yet. First, you're going to release Miss Galloway. Then you're going to face charges for the murder of Josiah Galloway, attempted murder of his daughter, corruption, extortion, and whatever else the territorial court decides to add." Walton laughed. "And who's going to enforce these charges? The sheriff is indisposed and the town is mine." "Not anymore," came Sheriff Parker's voice as he appeared at the other end of the alley, flanked by several townspeople including Dr. Simmons and the general store owner. All were armed. Walton's expression faltered as he realized he was trapped. With slow deliberation, he released Clara, who immediately moved away from him toward Lucas. "This changes nothing," Walton declared, attempting to maintain his composure. "I have connections in the territorial capital, friends in high places. I'll be free before nightfall." "Perhaps," Lucas acknowledged, "but your reputation won't recover, and while you're gone, the people of Red Bluff will dismantle everything you've built here." Sheriff Parker stepped forward with handcuffs. Elias Walton, you're under arrest for the murder of Josiah Galloway and numerous other crimes against the people of Red Bluff. As Parker led Walton away, surrounded by armed citizens to prevent any rescue attempt by his remaining men, Clara sagged against Lucas in relief. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his arms supporting her. Clara shook her head. "No, just shaken." She looked up at him. "Did we succeed?" "With the petition." Lucas nodded. "James and Frank got away clean, and with Sheriff Parker's testimony added to our evidence, Walton's control of Red Bluff is finished." The aftermath of Walton's arrest unfolded rapidly. Most of his men, seeing their employer in custody and the town turned against them, chose to leave rather than face similar charges. Those most directly implicated in violent acts were detained alongside Walton in the jail, now guarded by coalition members until the territorial marshal could arrive. Sheriff Parker, restored to his position and freed from Walton's influence, proved surprisingly effective at maintaining order during the transition. He worked closely with Lucas and Clara to document Walton's crimes and prepare for the formal investigation that would follow. 3 days after the arrest, James and Frank returned from the territorial capital with news that the governor had dispatched a marshal and a circuit judge to Red Bluff to handle the serious charges against Walton and his associates. "It's really over, isn't it?" Clara asked Lucas as they stood on the newly laid foundation of her rebuilt cabin. Construction had begun immediately after Walton's arrest, with volunteers from town and neighboring claims joining together to replace what had been destroyed. "Walton's control of Red Bluff is over," Lucas confirmed, though the legal proceedings will likely continue for months. Clara surveyed the busy construction site, then looked beyond to where the spring bubbled peacefully from the hillside. "My father would be pleased. Not just that justice will be done, but that the community came together to make it happen." Lucas nodded, watching her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "You made that possible, Clara. Your courage inspired others to find their own." She shook her head modestly. "We all did it together." She paused, then added more softly, "including you, especially you." Lucas took her hand, his expression growing more serious. "I received another letter from my brother this morning." Clara's heart tightened, knowing what must be coming. "He needs you to return." "Yes," Lucas confirmed. "The situation with Jenkins has reached a critical point. With what we've learned here fighting Walton, Matthew believes we can organize a similar coalition in Wyoming. Turn the tide against Jenkins once and for all." Clara nodded, trying to hide her disappointment despite understanding the necessity. "When will you leave?" "That depends," Lucas said, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "On your answer to what I'm about to ask." Clara looked up at him questioningly. "I love you, Clara Galloway," Lucas stated simply. "These past weeks, watching you face unimaginable grief and danger with such strength and grace, I've come to love you in a way I never thought possible after Sarah died." Clara's breath caught, her heart suddenly racing. "Lucas, I know our situation is complicated," he continued earnestly. "Your life is here, with your father's claim. My brother needs me in Wyoming, but I meant what I said before. I won't leave without knowing where we stand." "I love you too," Clara whispered, the words coming easily now that he had spoken first. "I think I have since that first day when you sat with me in silence until I could speak again." Lucas's face transformed with joy. He cupped her cheek gently. "Then hear my proposal. Come with me to Wyoming, not to abandon your claim here, but to help build a coalition there as we did in Red Bluff. Once Jenkins is dealt with, we can split our time between both places, or decide together where our future lies." Clara considered this, the possibilities unfolding before her. What about the claim here? The water rights my father died protecting. Davies and some of the others have offered to oversee operations while you're away, Lucas explained. With Walton gone, the coalition can establish fair water access for everyone, just as your father wanted. You'd retain ownership and control, but wouldn't need to be here constantly. It was a practical solution, one that honored her father's legacy while allowing her to build a future with Lucas. Clara felt a sense of rightness settle over her. Yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Yes to all of it. To going with you to Wyoming, to fighting Jenkins as we fought Walton, to building a life together wherever that takes us. Lucas's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms. You've made me the happiest of men, Clara Galloway. Their kiss was a promise and a beginning sweet with the triumph of obstacles overcome and rich with the prospect of adventures to come. When they finally parted, Lucas kept his arms around her, both of them content in the moment of decision. When should we leave for Wyoming? Clara asked, practical even in her happiness. After your cabin is rebuilt and the marshal has what he needs for Walton's prosecution, Lucas replied. Perhaps 3 weeks if all goes well. Clara nodded, already mentally preparing for the journey and the challenges that would await them in Wyoming. And when we've dealt with Jenkins, what then? Lucas smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then we decide together. Perhaps we'll divide our time between your claim here and my brother's ranch, or maybe we'll find a place of our own, somewhere new. As long as we're together, Clara said, the simplicity of the statement containing all the certainty she needed. Always, Lucas promised. In the weeks that followed, Red Bluff underwent a transformation. With Walton's oppressive influence removed, the town seemed to breathe more freely. Businesses flourished, miners worked their claims without fear of sabotage, and a newly elected town council which included Dr. Simmons and the general store owner began establishing fair policies for water access and other resources. Clara's cabin was rebuilt, larger and sturdier than before, though she knew she would not be occupying it immediately. The territorial marshal arrived with the circuit judge, and the formal proceedings against Walton and his men began, with Clara providing key testimony about her father's murder. Throughout it all, Lucas remained by her side, their partnership deepening as they prepared for both the journey to Wyoming and the life they would build together. They were married in a simple ceremony in Pastor Williams's church, 2 days before their scheduled departure. The entire town turned out to celebrate, the festivities serving as both a wedding reception and a farewell to the couple who had helped free Red Bluff from Walton's control. On the morning they were to leave, Clara stood on the porch of her rebuilt cabin, taking a final look at the claim her father had loved so much. The spring bubbled cheerfully in the morning light, the sluice boxes had been repaired, and wildflowers had begun to reclaim the burned areas around the former cabin site. "Are you having second thoughts?" Lucas asked gently, coming to stand beside her. Clara shook her head. "No. Just saying goodbye for now." She touched the pocket watch she still carried, her father's most precious possession and now her most treasured keepsake. "He would understand. He always taught me that people are more important than places or things." Lucas put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "We'll come back, I promise. I know." Clara turned to face her husband, her expression serene despite the magnitude of the changes they were embarking upon. "But for now, Wyoming awaits, and Jenkins won't defeat himself." Lucas laughed, the sound free and unencumbered in a way it hadn't been when they first met. "No, he won't, but he doesn't know what's coming for him." "Just like Walton didn't," Clara agreed with a small smile. They descended the porch steps together, where James, Frank, and Tom waited with the horses and wagon that would take them on the first leg of their journey. Davies and several other coalition members had come to see them off, promises of diligent care for the claim exchanged once more. As they mounted their horses and began the ride away from Red Bluff, Clara glanced back one last time at the town nestled in the valley, and the small claim that had been the center of so much conflict and change. Then she turned her gaze forward, to the man riding beside her and the open road ahead. "Ready?" Lucas asked, his eyes bright with anticipation for their shared future. Clara nodded, her heart full. "Ready." Together, they urged their horses forward, leaving Red Bluff behind but carrying with them the lessons and love they had found there, a grief-stricken silence, transformed into a partnership of strength, purpose, and enduring devotion.